Good morning, everyone. And as Steve has said, I haven't managed to come back here. I think I came back here 6 years ago, and I haven't yet made it back to the lab, but I'm going to stroll over there. So be warned. Give all your colleagues a warning. I might wander in the building. I'm going to talk today and pick up very much what Wendy has just described, all the different messages. And I'm going to try and give you some numbers around what's happening in Europe. Europe is not a very popular place at the moment, but I can be, I think, at one level, very optimistic, because it's only at the European level that we actually get sanity when it comes to be talking about the oceans and the marine environment. There's a preoccupation with many people in the UK to become obscurely obsessed with small details and to lose sight of the big picture. So it is amazing sometimes to see how our colleagues lift their game once they sit inside a European setting. And I'm going to talk about that because, on the whole, we should be fairly happy about the way, in a sense, the regulatory backdrop is developing. Whether it's actually going to roll out here in this country is another matter, but in many other parts of Europe, there's a sort of an alacrity and an appetite to really engage with the kind of marine environment and what it means for the rebuilding of the economy. One of the most important things I've noticed in all the rhetoric is that the marine environment is absolutely seen as one of the most complex, difficult challenges when it comes to combining sectoral development, ecosystem management, and just literally a sense of well-being. And those three, the proximity of them, because of the way in which the marine waters surround Europe, is brought home, I think, very much in many of the different discussions that I'm going to talk about now. And it's that complexity, I think, that has really challenged this community more than others. We have, I would say, rather simpler conversations to do with the freshwater side of things, the Water Framework Directive, the new blueprint. But as soon as we get close to the coastal area, then everything becomes far more complicated and more complex. But generally speaking, I think that we've got some of the best science and some of the best scientists involved in the marine discussions. And that in itself, I think, is also a very strong indication about where and what we're going to be doing. This is a well-known picture, I think, to most of you, 250 years of continuous use in relation to the planet's resources, whether it's through population use and so on and so forth. What we have seen, though, in the 1950s onwards is this huge acceleration in the use of the natural capital of the planet. And therefore, this sort of dramatic and unprecedented period has had, in our view and our analysis, certainly in Europe, the build-up not only of an economic debt, but also a very significant ecological debt. And part of the challenge at the moment is to try to see how, in a way, we're going to rebuild much of that ecological debt, but at the same time not compromise any opportunities for development. I think if you take the kind of three in the middle, those are the ones that we're kind of interested in: ocean ecosystems, the coastal zone, and the sort of biogeochemistry. And that has been the focus, I think, of a lot of research in recent years, and has really opened up people's eyes that multiple stressors, it's not just one single stressor, it's multiple stressors that are really the game that we have to be in. And none more so, I think, that when we look around, certainly the coasts of Britain, and we see these different processes and stresses really impacting upon each other. Marine spatial planning is one solution, but ultimately economics is not, and together with planning, is not going to be the only way out. We really have to evaluate what it is that we want to see the blue economy or the green economy with a blue tinge on it delivering for us. So let's just take a quick rendezvous with some of the data. Around Europe, we have, I think, a real challenge insofar as we do see that there are some parts of Europe's coastal waters where things are going in the right direction. So you might think that 10% is a very low number, but given that 40% is unknown, actually that's quite a lot. So there's already a challenge for us to say what we do know, we can see are in good favourable status, but there's still much more work to be done. Some of the other numbers, you maybe can't quite see them because it's very bright, so I'll just read them out. Posidonia oceanica, 5% decline per year. Cod in the Kattegat, at about 5% of its levels in the 1960s. European eel, 1 to 7% of the stock biomass compared to 1971. Great auk became extinct, and the Baltic sturgeon in the 1990s. So these are the kind of the bad messages and the trends. But as I say, I put that against 40% unknown. So what we do know is mixed, but there is still potential. And every single week, I think we see new finds, small niche ecosystems which have been preserved, which have resilience in the Mediterranean even. And so I think that this is our biggest challenge, is how do we interpret the data that we do have to give us strong signals as to how to act. Again, because of the light, you won't be able to see this so very clearly. But overall, if we look at the data from ICES, many of you will already participate, I think, in some of their working groups. This is just a kind of repeated message again and again about how different species, both in the marine environment and the coastal areas, are having a kind of mixed picture between favourable and unfavourable and unknown. The message in 2010 then, for the political parties and so on, was that we had failed comprehensively, particularly around biodiversity. We failed to meet the target of halting the loss of biodiversity. What that did was it put a lot of people on notice. It brought a lot of marine biologists, a lot of conservationists into the picture, because what they said was, well, actually this is a terrible situation, and then on the other hand they said, but we keep finding, we keep looking, we keep seeing, and we're not really understanding actually what's going on. So what that did, in fact, was to put on the map, so to speak, all the different pieces of legislation to try to understand why it was that the data we had was really not fit for purpose. We could not actually say what was actually happening. And this is a kind of composite picture which has got all the different legislation, the Habitats Directive, Natura 2000, and all the different pieces laid one upon another, and to try to give an idea of the conservation status of coastal and marine habitats. And yes, of course, there's a lot of red, and the red is unfavourable. But unfavourable is a very interesting concept in terms of legislation versus reality. And this is the kind of hard truth, which is we have put in place, albeit very important, the kind of rules and regulations which mean that if you fail in one place, you fail overall. And in a way, this is really politically a difficult message to sell, because for the marine habitats, huge investments have gone in terms of urban wastewater treatment, cleaning up coastal areas for bathing water and so on. So on the one hand, the politicians have said, well, we did the business. We invested, millions and millions and millions of euros and pounds and so on. And now you're telling us that it's all for nothing because the map is red. So this is really not a good message. And so over the last sort of 2 years, what has emerged then is a need to be far, far more clear about what is failing and actually what is good. And instead of using this rather banal approach, which is just paint the half of the circle red and, bad boy, go to prison, pay fines, no, let's actually try to understand what is working and what isn't working. So it was very much on this thinking that the idea of the blueprint and the way in which we deal with water, coastal waters, marine environment, the Marine Framework Strategy Directive, and so on and so forth, are now shaping up and are being framed. But of course, what that means is that you need a whole different kind of information. What you need is sort of real-time information from pretty much everybody across the piece. And the first place that we need more information from are the maritime industries. So we have a pretty impressive coastal and sort of offshore sector when it comes to oil and gas. We also have a pretty impressive maritime shipping tradition. We have resource extraction, offshore energy, bioprospecting, and so on. So when you look across the picture, in terms of contributions under the flagships, the Europe 2020 flagships, maritime sectors are extraordinarily important. However, it's really very, very clear that despite that big rump of investment in the oil and gas, 90% of employment comes in terms of tourism and transport. So if you're looking to invest in people and employment, the two sectors that will take the most attention are in shipping, transport, and in tourism. So it's a big difference when today we're talking about mass unemployment as opposed to big investment, where you actually see the kind of political discussion and where we need to find out, in a way, what's happening. Now, I'll just quickly spend a few moments on the oil and gas industry. Because of the sort of recent events in the North Sea, with the evacuation platform and so on and so forth, it came as a rather embarrassing question when somebody said, well, when you'd evacuated the platform, why was it still flaring? So how was it that this platform, which was supposed to be at risk and everyone had left, was still flaring? And it became very obvious that even in the Deepwater Horizon situation and here, that with the very, very best practice, we still are not monitoring systems when effectively you're under extreme events, when you're under emergencies. And what that has done, unfortunately, has raised the profile of safety and risk. And in this particular case, it's going to bring potentially a regulation. And I can tell you a regulation is not what this industry needs. What it needs is actually better investment in the kind of metrology and monitoring and observing that can happen when these platforms are evacuated or when they're not actually manned. So that's just one small example of how we think that we have the best practice, we think we have the best industries, and yet even something as trivial as what happens when nobody's on the platform, we haven't really taken care of. And I think that's the point about maritime sectors here, is that they now have to, in a sense, provide the justification for their operations. There are no neutral operations. Everybody emits gases, greenhouse gases. Everybody has the potential to have an imprint, a footprint on the environment, but also to have a footprint on the employment and on the social and economic sectors. So whilst this sector particularly has generated huge benefits in terms of economics and social aspects, it still has to justify how it will manage in the coming years as effectively operating conditions become harder. And this is at the very heart of the green economy. Now, whether or not this government buys in wholeheartedly to what's happening in Europe, I can tell you that most other European countries are. And what that means is that there's a different rebalancing between straight GDP and what it means in terms of social well-being, employment, but also, to a large extent, the environment. And this idea of well-being and inclusivity, these are not just sort of bywords that appear in a Rio statement. Actually, they're calculated. They're looking, in a sense, at how that natural capital, social capital, and economic capital really will sustain the European economy. And there are seismic shifts that are going on in terms of what is the evidence that's required to actually stimulate the type of investment that will generate the kind of well-being across the economy and prosperity. None more so, I think, than in the maritime sector. It is almost as if, having built the roads, the motorways, the infrastructure on land, people are now looking out to the kind of port heads, to the integration, to thinking in a very, very different way about what it is when it comes to moving goods and services around Europe. A sort of an integration which means that you don't ship things halfway across the country to then realign them, to then ship them back again. All of that. And the maritime sector itself is mobilizing in a sort of comprehensively different way with, I would say, ecosystem resilience and greenhouse gas emissions at their core. And why are they doing that? Well, and here's another kind of good news message for those of us who worry about the quality of the environment, that the effort sharing directive has now taken off. And what does that mean? That means that outside of the emissions trading, the non-traded sectors, transport in particular, but all the other service sectors are now actually evaluated and auctioned according to their greenhouse gas emissions. And we've done the first round of negotiations, and it's very, very interesting to see how Maersk and other shipping companies, alongside of some of the infrastructure and transport companies, the fishing industry and so on, are actually lining themselves up to be in a strong position to, in a sense, receive, in some cases, I would say carbon subsidies, but in other cases, genuine lift up for investment to divert some of their activities. So these, what I would say, integrating processes, although they have a regulatory form behind them, are actually reshaping the environment and reshaping the economy. So to give you an example, Maersk, one of the biggest shipping companies that we have, has fundamentally transformed its entire fleet throughout the Baltic and sort of moving out into the Arctic and out into the north. And what have they done? Well, they've essentially set themselves a target of reducing their fuel consumption by 40% within 5 years. That is an enormous target. And how are they doing it? Well, they're doing it by slow speed shipping, changing the way in which they take goods and services, what they're expecting at the port head, and so on and so forth. So they're demanding of infrastructure so that the whole shipping industry when eventually the International Maritime Organization and governments agree, will set some limits on emissions, that they're already ahead of the game. And so the most innovative part about this is that we have shifted from a whole thinking about what you're doing is controlling the worst and setting standards for the worst performing, to benchmarking which is set around the best. And again, those of you who kind of aren't in the policy world may have missed that one, but the whole shift in the last sort of 3 years is that sectors are going to be evaluated by the top 10% performing as opposed to the bottom 50%, which means that if you're in the bottom 50%, you will be penalised, regardless of how and what you're doing, whether it's in shipping, in transport, in infrastructure development, in building, in construction, and so on. So again, I think that as these things bite, the demand for, well, what is good environmental performance? What does it actually look like when you look at a coastal development? When you look at the trade-offs with conservation, when you look at how you will actually develop flood development plans and so on. These will all be evaluated on the best performing as opposed to the average performing. So the demand for knowledge and evidence is just growing and growing and growing. And again, I think that when you look at these trends, they are really, I mean, in one sense, you would almost think they're unbelievable. To say that short sea shipping will be up by 100% within the next 20 years, 20, 30 years. To say that offshore wind and annual growth rates, which are already very high, will continue, will demand marine monitoring and surveillance. The cruise tourism experience is already sort of at a 10% growth rate and so on, and fisheries. So I think to ignore the rates of growth is one thing, but to think about them in terms of their overall production of environmental outputs as well as economic inputs is extremely important. Again, it's a very difficult side to see, and I won't sort of spend any time on it other than to say, though, that despite the planning difficulties in this country, other parts of Europe have actually ploughed on with offshore shifts away from oil and gas, this is the kind of Norwegian picture, towards what's actually happening in renewables. And just in renewables, I'm often asked about this, and I don't know, is there anyone here from the Wind Energy Association? No, there's no one here. I met someone on the airplane. I thought he might have been coming here, unfortunately, but he wasn't. If you look at Denmark, I just want to get the statistics, it is quite extraordinary. The installed, let me just get this exactly right. So, for Denmark, let's see. Oh, no, I'll do Germany first of all. Germany has already gone from 92 megawatts to 8,000 megawatts. France is from 4,000, going up to 4,000. I don't know what the UK will do. But in Denmark alone, well, the total offshore capacity is going to go from 250 to 2,900 by the end of this year. And we know that the installed amounts will double 2 years on. So despite all the rhetoric, despite everything, the investment in offshore wind energy, although it's relatively close to shore around Germany and other places, will actually produce the equivalent of energy requirements for 4 million households. And the whole industry itself, I mean, is employing 800,000 people. And that's just one small part. So when we hear that there's a 20% target for renewable energy across Europe, most countries that have the capacity to be in the maritime area will use their maritime sector. Absolutely, because the onshore debate is just too difficult. When we look at fisheries, there's a turning point. But what's fascinating about fisheries is that even though the number of vessels has gone down, they're actually more efficient. And we can come back to that again and again. But the real point is that the income is still holding up. It's nearly 5 billion euros a year. So as a sector, we have to manage it. We have to place it in its context around wind farms. We have to generally recognize that most of our stocks are still without advice. 40% of our stocks don't have advice on them. So yes, we've focused in the past on the key ones, but again, there's still a lot of information we don't have. And more importantly, with the sort of marine protected area movement, we still really don't have enough Natura 2000 and marine protected areas to make the case, although countries are beginning to roll out and secure those. So, at the very end, I think we have to say that it's a very complex situation. It is manageable. We still demand a lot more knowledge, a lot more monitoring, a lot more integration of that information. But there are some simple and easy things to do. For example, marine litter. It was one of the things that was picked up in Rio. It is absolutely clearly an impacting factor on many of our marine species and mammals and so on. We see, though, that this is a kind of area where public participation is also very crucial. So when I talk about the need for information, I talk about the need for monitoring and observing and so on. One of the fundamental difficulties has been, as you know, how to integrate information in a way which makes it accessible, freely available, and in a way usable. And so Eye on Earth, which is a platform that we're using to support the UN, was in the Rio Declaration, is one such approach. Working with the oil and gas industry, working with the shipping industry, working with research scientists in the big programs, but also with local authorities, it's essentially possible for us now to bring small localized observations alongside some of the large big monitoring programs, whether they be from space or whether they be from large programs, for example, at the national level on marine conservation. And this just gives you one example. So looking at shipping and looking at marine protected areas, in principle, if you can sort of see it, there's a great big purple square on the top of Denmark there, which is a marine protected area. And no shipping is supposed to go through that. This is a dynamic live shipping map with the marine protected areas in it. And this snapshot shows you that over that period, I think it was the first 6 months in 2010, I think something of the order of 20,000 vessels actually took a shortcut and went across that marine protected area. It was the very first time that the Danish government had actually realized that vessels were taking a shortcut because, in principle, it's a very well monitored shipping lane. And these kinds of expositions where you put information into the hands of those who are either regulators or really trying to reduce risks or emergency services is what we're really looking at. But at the same time, it tells us that we've fundamentally got something wrong in the way that our marine planning has gone forward. We have a lot of citizens telling us about things, so we give them a system in the Eye on Earth to do exactly that, where they can actually inform us about large marine litter problems, about impacts, about coastal areas and so on. And the most interesting thing they say is, we would like to know about where algal blooms are, we want to know about the quality of water and so on. So the GMES program, which does provide a lot of data and information, is again something which citizens and others really need to have at their fingertips. And it's surprising how many people outside the research community have no idea how to access most of this information, to make very basic daily decisions on whether they're going to allow a small building plot or whether they're going to allow a port to develop and so on. So we have a sort of duty of care, I think, in all the international and the national institutes to make it easy for people to really talk about blue growth by facilitating information and evidence in a near real-time way, or at least in an informed way. To support this, the states have launched something called a green paper on marine knowledge. There's a consultation that's out now. And they're investing in things like seabed mapping and so on and so forth. It's an extremely important consultation because it will wrap up, so to speak, all the different voices across the blue economy. And the idea, of course, is that wherever possible, these will become freely available and open. And in the end, what we are trying to achieve is, alongside GDP, measures that will actually talk about the marine and the maritime sector. And so here's an example, it's my last slide, that this is a cooperation between Denmark, Germany, Norway, and Sweden to create a composite analysis of information on nutrients, essentially on shipping, cables, ecosystems, particular species, but also more integrative parts to do with muds and sediments and plankton and the whole complex feeding chain. And in the end, to have an assessment of the cumulative human impacts, and on that there will be derived, together for the Baltic as well, a composite which is a beyond GDP calculation, which has within it a measure of resilience, sustainability, economic returns, but also the demand for economic restoration. There's a restoration cost in that, which will sit alongside the system of national accounts. So these 5 countries, I mean the Netherlands is also coming on board, they will bring to the Council of Ministers, which is an important sort of venue for us, They will bring along a maritime measure which in a sense goes beyond GDP and talks about the contribution of the marine and maritime world using all those different sectors and ultimately looking at what the economic costs are, but also what the social and the other aspects of well-being are to maintain a healthy marine and maritime environment. So it's an extremely important prototype, an extremely important pilot, and it draws in a sense, the economies that sit behind it, the German economy, the Norwegian, the Swedish, the Danish, and potentially the Dutch economies. And it will ask fundamental questions of, do we continue to invest, for example, in the oil and gas industry, or should we invest in our coastal areas, because that's in a sense where the biggest employment and also potential benefits for investing in resilience in our ecosystems really resides around tourism and around transport. And I think these are the kinds of information composites that ultimately where our research will fit very, very comfortably, but also where this will have tremendous influence on how policymakers will begin to think about the maritime and marine environment. Thank you very much.